Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Renée.
Thank you.
We have the pleasure to have Renée Cunningham, or Cunningham, the Italian way. We rehearsed the surname, but the Italian way always makes it. So tonight we are presenting this book from Renée, Archetypal Nonviolence. I had the pleasure to have it and to read it. And I would like, before to leave the floor to Renée, actually, to look at the introduction that it kicks off full of power. When you write about Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African-American boy who had been beaten, shot, and lynched in Mani, Mississippi on August 28, 1955. Immediately, my mind went to George Floyd, but not only to him. Things seems not different at all compared to 1955. This is not a question, it's just an introduction, perhaps a powerful introduction. We're very happy to have you here. You're a couple therapist. You're a therapist since 28 years, originally from Alabama. Welcome, Renée. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefano, Bernard, and Paul. And thanks everyone for showing up today. I know if you're like me, there's so much going on. It's very hard to take time out to slow down and be present with these very difficult, charged issues. So my hope today is that you can somehow take away from what I'm talking about some idea of how we hold nonviolence within ourselves and how we might work on that, and how we can proliferate nonviolence in a world that idealizes violence, both in our art and in the ways that we actually treat each other. I kept contemplating where I wanted to start with this, but I think Emmett Till is a wonderful beginning, a wonderfully tragic, sad beginning. Emmett Till's murder was the flashpoint for the civil rights movement. And I was struck in doing the research for this book that I believe it was from 1955 to 1964 to the day was the March on Washington, where King gave his I Have a Dream speech, and this very opposite image of how he wanted children to be held and treated. And so it was from that march forward that the civil rights movement really took hold. So it's difficult to talk about this material from my perspective without actually being personal. As most people who write analytic material, there is something not just in the unconscious, but in that writer's life that grips and compels them. And I can honestly say that this material surprised me. It surprised me in the way it showed up. It surprised me in how it's gripped me. It has surprised me in many ways as to how it has shown up in culture again with this incredible timing and impact. I believe the material is powerful, important, and poignant for our time. Because as we all know, archetypes are live in a lack of a time-space continuum, and that they emerge through different factors in culture and individual. So I'll start by talking a little bit about how this material came to be for me. I had been in my analytic work personally and in training, working around personal issues which had powerful resonance with flashes of image and no meaning attached to them. And over the years of my personal work, there was an image that appeared over and over and over again, which I initially thought was rather kind of funny. But as I deepened my practice and got further in my training, I began to realize that this image was incredibly important in my own mythological narrative. The experience was one of being 6 years old and running away from kindergarten. I was raised in a very small town deep in the south of Alabama, in the middle of the civil rights movement from 1961 until 1972. I was lucky enough to have a father who was stationed in one place at one time for long enough for me to live my formative years in Alabama. And my father was trained as a pilot in the Vietnam War, in which he attended or was stationed 2 times. He had two tours there. But the event of running away from kindergarten was catapulted into, if you will, the event itself was stimulated by a teacher accusing me of something I had not done. And it was the first visceral memory of being rageful and wrathful. And I marched home during the break and refused to go to kindergarten again because of the injustice. While that seems like an innocuous example, it was really the beginning of a childhood depression that I think lasted for a significant period of time, that had a lot to do with my father going away, no explanation, the violence of the Vietnam War, the unexplained racism in my town, the unexplained racism in the country, and the riots and the rage that was going on all around me as a little girl that no one really talked about. So my fascination with King began when I was tiny. It hasn't ended. I'm 62 now. And there were images of King as a little girl during that time that were on my television set that captivated me, that provided me with some hope, some understanding of what was happening around me when the adults in the room and in the community could not really explain the violent events in my community. So as I grew older, I never really understood why King was so fascinating for me, outside of the fact that he was a powerful figure representing a very dark aspect of our human nature. And so in 2013, during a pivotal time in my training, there was a conference in Birmingham, and it offered me the opportunity for the first time in 55 years to go back to Alabama, to visit the place where I grew up, to try to make sense of some events that happened to me. And so I rented a car and I drove down to this small town. And along the way, I had this idea of writing about Selma with no understanding of why the idea showed up in my mind. I did remember it from history. And when I got to my hotel room, synchronistically, the next spring was to be the 50th anniversary. So I followed that breadcrumb, and the experiences that I had on revisiting Alabama were profoundly powerful, impactful, emotional. It felt as if racism lived still in the soil of every part of the South that I visited. And it was something I can't explain, except that I was compelled that I had to write this story. So that's how the book really began for me. And on the way back to Birmingham, I went to Selma after I had the idea and looked up the information on the computer. I was stunned to see that the first march in Selma was my 6th birthday. And so going to the town, I went to the bridge, I went to the courthouse, I visited the church. I didn't get to go inside, but I knew where it was. And so I was gripped by the story. And that began the experience of writing the dissertation. After the dissertation in 2017 and graduating, the book would, the story just would not let me go. And it deepened for me even more. And so I submitted the proposal, the book came out, and here we have it. But I think what's really important as well is that the topic of racism for me was exceedingly important in defining who I was as a child. And that it is something I'm still trying to come to understand, because I believe that racism intersected with my own voicelessness as a child and the violence around me and the oppressive forces of growing up in a military system. And while this is not equal to racism, in my experience of being a human being, they still are merged in very interesting ways and intersect with being a woman, being raised in a culture of oppression, being raised in a military system, and the desire to do something in my life as in becoming an analyst. They are all connected. I think it's very important also that I say that King was a fascination for me because he represented, I believe, the split that developed in my grief of losing the father I knew who went away to Vietnam, and a relationship that I developed in my mind with this comforting, powerful man. So this is where the story began. And then I will say that my fascination with my own inner aggressor, my struggle with my own anger and rage, my absolute desire to understand and try and come to terms with to the best of my ability with that inner aggressor, compelled my work as an analyst, my work as an individual, and also my hope to be able to contribute somehow to the fractured state of our divided states now, whether they be with our patients in analysis or in our communities and culture. So this material is exceedingly powerful. I don't have all the answers, but I do enjoy the conversation around where we are to go next, where we are in our culture and our collective state now, and what really is nonviolence. Archetypally, how does it show up in all of us? What does it say about how we can utilize the ethos or the ethics of nonviolence in a way to come to know the inner other in ourselves? I really believe that nonviolence in and of itself, while we know it as a structurally transformative theory, meaning that social and political change can happen when it's utilized, what Selma really talks about is how nonviolence is a psychological position. It is a spiritual path that has no end, but is a goal within which we can all move towards, as Gandhi says, unconsciously and throughout the lifespan. From my understanding as a Jungian analyst, nonviolence itself is exceedingly organic in the analytic experience and can only happen in one's relationship with the self, with self and other, and the ongoing conversation of consciousness in the face of aggression and violence in the analytic space. When I'm talking about violence, I'm talking about inner turgid waters of the unconscious, and the projective process of violence and projection of the other as the enemy, or the other as the harmer. So what I really came to understand and image in my mind around nonviolence is that in the holding of tension of opposites in our work and our capacity to work on this throughout our lifespan, we open the door to the numinous or to the self within which that symbol, whatever that symbol is, whatever it looks like, that is hidden in the subjective third between the analyst, the analysand, or individuals in a relationship, the likelihood of that symbol showing up is, how shall I say, much more fertile with the practice of nonviolence. And so in the book, I really use examples of Gandhi's satyagraha and ahimsa, and I explore King's 6 tenets of nonviolence, not as the concretized or the way to do it, but as examples of how nonviolence, particularly archetypal nonviolence, was delivered in mass to America through King and his lieutenants. And that at the pinnacle of the Selma movement, we see what the practice, the ongoing practice of these tenets do to the collective zeitgeist. And while consciousness was delivered only momentarily or enough for the deliverance of the passing of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that is the, shall we say, the nodal point within which, the ideal within which we're always moving towards in America, I believe, regardless of our regressive movements in violence. And so Selma was very important to examine, not only in our cultural and country development, but for us to look more at in terms of individual practice, particularly given, for instance, the dissolution in organized religion all over the world. I believe it's a very containing force and a feminine force that can really help us unify collectively and work towards what I feel is annihilating forces to our species right now, particularly around climate change. So I think with that, I'll leave the floor open to questions. I think I've said about all I can right off the top of my head, and so I'm happy to clarify and talk about whatever you all feel is important to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Your book is skinny, but it's so powerful from the very first word to the last one. I have 2 questions. I will try to condensate them. One is provocative, but we discuss about that question. We rehearse, because I looked at us. I think we are 35. Yeah. 98% of the audience is white. And this is very interesting. Of course, we can relate to what Andrew Samuels, Alan Vaughan discussed in Vienna last summer at the World Conference, the fact that we should open to analysts, to training, and to people of different areas, and why the majority of the analysts are white. But the question for you is, why a woman that is white writes this book? Where does it come from? You gave me the best answer before. Just repeat that. I know it's very personal for you, but it's important what you said before.
Well, no, I can't remember what I said before because you have me on the spot. But well, it's really interesting. As a white person speaking about it, I don't think about it in terms of the fact that I'm white. I think about it in terms of the fact that, well, if whites are mostly part of the problem, and that I grew up in the South, and I understand from a white point of view the disgust, the abuse, the oppression. Why would my voice not matter? It's so, I don't want to learn, for instance, about racism from another white person. I want to learn it from both. I want to learn it from African Americans. I want the conversation to be open with both. And there is, I mean, we are in a relationship. When I grew up, Blacks lived on the other side of town. We weren't communicating. We weren't related. I only knew them through people that were their housekeepers, or I had a teacher, thankfully, in grade school who was very had a tremendous impression upon me. But because I'm a privileged white woman, why would I not have something to say that I could learn from the other side around what I need to know, and vice versa? I understand from many people that it said, and this I don't understand, that white people need to do the work that they haven't done for centuries around this issue. I couldn't agree more, but I need the other to help me understand. I need a dialogue with the other to help me understand. I won't know it any other way.
What you said before, when we were chit-chatting before to start this webinar, you said, because I had a question in my mind, and until I wrote the book, I couldn't get that question out of my mind. So it's something very personal. That's what I like from your answer, that although you're white, you had a question that it matters so much to you, and the result is this book. Please send us your question through the message, through the chat box. I will read the question and share it with Renée. The first question is from Susan. Can you say more about nonviolence as active, not passive, especially in the context of it being archetypal?
Yes. So that's a really great question. I think the thing about archetypal nonviolence for me is that King says that it is active, it is not passive resistance. So active resistance is the capacity to hold the unknown in a relationship and to not act out violently in thought, well, as Gandhi would say, thought, word, and deed, until something new comes in the third to shift that tension. And so nonviolence in and of itself is sort of a procedure, if you will, of holding what you feel in projective processes with the other, or holding anger, or holding the tension of conflict. I guess in some ways it could be called hold your tongue until something other comes in to shift the energy in the room, to bring in a new form of consciousness, so that self-reflection is certainly a piece of this. Now, how that image, or what that image is to be, usually comes up in holding that tension. Now, on one end of the experience of nonviolence, we have tactics and strategies, which we certainly use in the analytic frame, which sometimes is just silence. Sometimes it might be encouragement. Sometimes it might be, how do I say, interpretation. Sometimes it might be meditating silently on the image that may come to you around healing with the other that emerges in the third. So these are tactics. But the philosophical part is to actually not do much at all, but hold what is happening. And in violent tendencies or aggression, to hold and not act out, and to self-reflect on how you might be part of the process and how you may be contributing.
Thank you. Susan also added, but your book is also a white person doing the work. There is a question from Alan. Can you speak to origin of violence toward African Americans out of your personal family experience in the dialectics of nonviolence?
In the what of not in the what of nonviolence?
Dialectics of nonviolence.
Is Alan asking me how I came to nonviolence in my own personal life through family experiences of racism?
Outside your experience of racism, if I understand, can you speak to origin of violence toward African American out of your personal family experience in the dialectical mode of nonviolence? And then he adds, as a child, I could not understand the rage and violence toward African Americans. Can you say something about archetypal violence in contrast to archetypal nonviolence?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can answer that from my own personal experience, if that would help, Alan. Because I couldn't understand as a child the anger towards whites. So one example I can give of that, there's a couple. One is when I was in the 7th grade, which would have been 1971, I could not square this in my mind. In 71, segregation was against the law in Alabama, but as we know, it was still practiced. So when I would go to school, the bus would pick us up, drop us off at the school, and in the gym, the blacks would be waiting to get on that same bus and be taken to their school. So one day, as I was preparing for gym class, which was in the gym, I was walking across the gym and had a shoe thrown at me and hit me in the head. And I turned around and realized that it was a black girl sitting up in the middle of this big group of people. And I did not conduct nonviolence, Alan. And I was raised in a scrapper kind of family with boys. And I confronted her, and it almost ended up in a fist fight. So from that point of view, well, we were literally saved by the bell, by the way. So from that point of view, I did not know anything about nonviolent tactics, principles, philosophy, the application of them. For me, I was immersed completely in the experience of the aggression and violence between the races for what I felt was no apparent reason, but in that moment was very charged with all the reasons that culture had integrated into me unconsciously or put into me unconsciously. And then years later, I would fall in love with a Black man in my 20s. And I had people in my family who disowned me. His family was different. They were accepting. But we both experienced forms of racism on either side of the relationship. And it's probably those experiences that led me to want to know, why was nonviolence effective? In the spaces that I experienced violence in my life, I never knew any way to mediate it, any way to end it, any way to work with it. And so part of my exploration, or most of my exploration of nonviolence, was to help me understand how I could mediate my own inner aggression and the aggression that came out towards others.
Question from Sarah. I think I understood you to say that in the consulting room, there is a way to practice nonviolence in terms of having aggression, hate, etc., entering into the relationship through projective identification. Is that a reasonable restatement? And in what ways might we work on these non-violently?
Yeah, I did not mean projective identification. I meant the capacity to hold the projection in the transference from the patient, and being able to hold that projection and your own feelings about it, your own ego experience, and then self-reflect in that projection that the patient is giving you on ways in which that is a projection, not a ways in which it is a projection, it may not be a projection, and ways in which you can hold both of those and talk about it. And that in the nonviolent dialogue that you can develop with the patient about that, something new may emerge around relatedness, that in that projection, a power paradigm may be set in place or set in motion. One of the things that I do talk about in the book, which I think is exceedingly important, and for me, probably the most important thing, is how we, in our analytic work, contain aggression to hatred. And we know that it is on a spectrum. And we also understand that hatred can be pathological. And so at what points does nonviolence not work? Do we need to exit that relationship where there is a danger of moving beyond the apex of the capacity to relate nonviolently to a form of sadomasochism, which can get set in motion between two people, leading to negative conjunctios, therapeutic failure, and damage to both people psychologically, spiritually, and emotionally. And I think this is the quintessential idea of what we're trying to contain culturally that is so very, very difficult. Yeah.
Fabrizio has 2 comments. You just shared one. So if you want to share the second one, you're welcome, Fabrizio. You would like to know more about inner work to foster non-violence attitude, the non-violence attitude.
He would like to know more ways in which you can do the inner nonviolent work.
How to foster the non-violent attitude or the non-violence attitude.
Yeah, I think there are so many ways. In Buddhism and in Hinduism, one can practice their own capacity to hold the moment, stay in the moment, be in the moment, work with one's own states of aggression, impatience, projection. And then in our own analytic work, it's important, of course, the core of the analytic work is shadow work. And we culturally, I think, are losing very quickly our capacity for self-reflection, which, as Jung says, is an instinctual process. So as therapists and analysts, we often spend a great deal of time reflecting on how we participate in these paradigms that get set in place. Much of what I attempt to do in my own work is to slow down, be present, be in a meditative state, and also to very much attempt to connect with the other through eye contact, body resonance, communication, interpretation, and most importantly, emotional vulnerability, while also being active mentally. This goes back to, I think, Susan Rowland's question or comment about how do we hold nonviolence. It's an active process of always watching, listening deeply, meditating on how you as an individual can communicate to the other in a non-conflictual, non-confrontational, well, sometimes it is confrontational, let's just be open about it. Sometimes what that person needs is a confrontational comment or a confrontational interpretation, because it can be delivered in no other way. You've tried every other way to do that. But it's all about consciousness. and what that looks like in the moment.
We have a question for George. It's a long one, and I'm tired because here is almost 10, so apologize for my English. In regards to archetypes, how would you suggest we steer our psyche to one rather than the other? Do you think some are intrinsically drawn to some more than others, as it may be similar to complexes in a sense in that we develop certain things which help groups us in those complexes in a way we can suggest people don't have complexes, but rather complexes have us?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a very interesting question, right? Because if complexes have us, how do we work with going one way or another? Right? Well, consciousness is what softens the complex. And so this really, I think, appeals again to the activism in nonviolence, that holding that tension without doing anything sometimes for a very long time may be the way of inviting a new consciousness in. And by the way, that new consciousness is not always going to be good or right or just. It may actually be a repressed violent tendency that both people have been participating in that needs to come out. So it is the capacity to hold and invite, but observe and reflect. And also that it is the nature of the patient that we're working with, but it's also that is in the room, and also that we are containing through our observing and deep listening.
Question from...
Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
It's a new question, so if you have a few more words, you're welcome.
No, I don't. Go ahead, Stefano. It's okay.
Fran, how is the holding in archetypal nonviolence like the holding in attachment theory? This is very interesting work. What can we do to include the experience of ourselves without negation and still honor the experience of being Afro-American?
Yes, I think this is so very important. And this is what I believe makes philosophical nonviolence, not tactical nonviolence, so very, very difficult. Because at any given time, right, we're holding our personal complexes, and then we have the influence of the cultural complex, which sits right there all the time. And so how do we determine? And often it's not logic that's going to do this. It's not reason. It's not even necessarily feeling. It is the archetypal world that is at work. The only thing, the example that I have to give here would be when one does not know, one eventually is surprised by what they know in the holding of the unknown. So for instance, in the Selma marches, the very moment that seems to flip the zeitgeist is when both when both key individuals, King and President Johnson, don't know what they are going to do, and they cannot rely on what they know. They have to give it up to the unconscious. And in surrendering to that very process of the unknown, everything comes together because the defenses are no longer holding. And I really reflect a lot on this moment when I'm working with patients around my own impatience, my need to know, my need to control, my need to be in power or to be in charge so that I can feel like I have some idea of what I'm doing. And it's often only in those moments where I actually have to let go of all of that and just be present in the moment to see what psyche will offer me, which is usually connected to them, or what psyche will offer that is theirs that they are sharing with me. And that is nonviolence for me, at least in my experience.
Lavinia is asking, Renée, can you say something about the nonviolence and a healthy defense mechanism that can by the other person be perceived as very violent, aggressive.
How I can, so that when another is being violent and aggressive, how I work with that non-violently?
Yeah, kind of an healthy defense mechanism.
Yeah.
When the other person can be perceived as violent and aggressive toward you. Mm-hmm. I hope this is what Lavinia meant. Sorry if I didn't get it.
Usually in those moments, what I will appeal to is a truth that I'm feeling defended, and I'm wanting to relate to them instead. And could they describe to me what's underneath their aggression? Or I may say something like, I may appeal to their capacity to listen deeply to themselves and express what is happening. I may say, what is it about what I've done that has offended you? And I may own up to it. I may say, you know, you're right about that. I am doing that. And yet I want to know something about you in this process too. What might be going on with you as well? So I bring it often to a human level of humility and vulnerability, and also working on their projection so that I may hold both. I may own up to the projection, but then I'll return to what it is in them that they're angry about. And so that both of us in that moment can break through the power paradigm to a more vulnerable related place. Do I have time to just tell one little story?
Yeah, we have 10 minutes, more than 10 minutes. We can go on all the night or all the afternoon since you're in the US. So we have as much time as you want. Okay.
Well, there's a story, and I think I put it in the book, that I found. There's a couple of them, but it addresses this question in terms of King. So people always said King was so masterful in how he addressed violence that came his way. And there was a story of them when they went north up to Chicago, which was an exceedingly violent place. And they were doing a march around a park. And a white woman came up to King and spat on him and said something really nasty to him. And he looked at her and said, you know, you're way too beautiful to be so mean. And, you know, we could think about this in a sexist way, but we could also think about it in a nonviolent way, which is that he had this capacity in that moment to address something in her unconscious that she responded to, whatever that was. We'll never know, except that a couple of hours later, she came up to him and apologized. And while he was a very powerful figure, and that this may have led to that because of who he was, we have to look at the capacity for him on some level, perhaps, to know unconsciously what she needed in that very moment. And this, of course, is what they trained a lot for in the civil rights marches. They trained for years and years about this. And they were often trained not to do anything until something came up around an intervention. And it was often with sitting and saying nothing, and then something would come to them, and they would say it, they would do it, and it would work. Now, sometimes it didn't, but their training was similar to what we do in analysis with how we hold what we do not know.
The second bit of Fabrizio's question is, I would like to make a connection with Erik Erikson's work and Gandhi and Judith Butler just released book on nonviolence.
I have Judith Butler's book, but I haven't read it. But I think, Fabrizio, you're bringing up a very important point, which is how the personal complexes of people like Gandhi and King and Jung related to their work and expressed their work. And so Erik Erikson was the first one that actually related Gandhi's intrapsychic dynamics to his nonviolent theory, which was connected mostly to his father complex. And then we have King, whose life was fascinating and also connected to his father complex, because his father was a minister, his grandfather was a minister, and his great-grandfather, I think, was a minister and a slave. And so all of them were actually very prominent activists in the South that worked very hard to change the school systems, the communities, and they did it from their pulpit. So here we have King, who comes in and is trained as a minister with an incredible mind, was very hesitant about becoming the leader of the civil rights movement, but actually picked up the mantle, and even in his shadow complex, carried his father's stuff into the work of nonviolence. And he was raised, unfortunately, with a father that was physically abusive with him. And so he carried these elements of his father complex into his work, and his desire to, I think, handle his ancestral pain and his cultural pain, and healing it through his family line. So it's a very, very powerful story.
I would like now to do something we don't do often. Actually, we did it only once, but I don't know if this person is able to connect. Alan, if we connect your mic and you connect your video, are you up to ask your new question to Renée? I'm looking the other way because I have another screen. I don't know if Alan can join us. Yes. Alan?
So, listen, I can't join you on the screen. I'm just recovering.
It's okay. Hi, welcome.
But yeah, so Renée, hi, how are you? And thank
Hi,
you for
I'm okay.
the
Alan,
presentation.
how are you?
Good, good. Listen, I just wanted you to comment on the life of John Lewis as an example of archetypal nonviolence, whether or not he's featured in your book. I've ordered the book. I haven't had the chance to read it yet, but that question came to my mind, and I am looking at the legislation that he's proposed on voter suppression as part of a paper that I've just finished for JP, and I wanted to know what you thought of John Lewis's life in relation to your theory about archetypal nonviolence.
Yeah, I think that John Lewis was a magical person. Mm-hmm. What he did with his life after his work in Selma is remarkable. One of my memories of him that's so striking is the sit-in that he conducted the year before he passed in the Senate. And he was inspirational on many levels. And his story, too, about how he met King was really beautiful. And he was from Troy, Alabama. My father got his business degree from Troy State University. And so he was interested in nonviolence. I really wanted to know more of John Lewis's story myself, but have not had a chance to do much work on that. Mm-hmm. But I think archetypally, yes, his march on Bloody Sunday across the bridge in Selma, I think sealed him as one of the most important leaders of the movement as well. And he was interesting in the sense that he really carried on King's work into government. And I would not be surprised if much of the legislation like they're passing now And even legislation that is to come isn't because of the unconscious integration of nonviolence that has happened and been conducted with members of Congress and the Senate, even though they are particularly calcified and divided. I wonder about that a lot.
Alan, do you want to add something?
Well, I think Renee and I are going to be on a panel in July with the, and so we'll be able to talk more about it. I do feel personally that it's really quite a challenge to have come of age in the civil rights movement and to watch the violence on television and to somehow get to a place of nonviolence. It's still very, very difficult to deal with personal complexes and cultural complexes around that. And it's still quite a struggle, I think, today, where we are with racism in contemporary society. And, you know, I would love it if somebody had a cure for racism, or if you had any thoughts about that, Renee, that would be helpful to share from your thinking about archetypal nonviolence.
Mm-hmm. I actually was thinking about that this morning, like if I could do something different around racism, what would it look like? And I had all these ideas about sharing, but I don't think we're there yet. I think there's a lot of grief and sadness and rage that maybe being together cannot mediate yet. And I thought about how healing happens in one's own culture through ritual, grief, just like in Selma, right? They met in the church, they prayed, they debriefed, they did. I can only imagine the archetypal work that was going on in the churches before and after the marches. And that while the races worked together, there was something very important that needed to happen in the Black communities around healing. And I don't know what it's going to take in the white community for healing, since we sit primarily in a position, I don't like the word privilege, I do like the word hubris, or just unconscious, should we say, bias in some way. We can't see enough, so we can't feel what needs to be felt. And I really feel the only way that blindness, or one of the most important ways for the blindness to be peeled away, is one-on-one or community to community, grieving and talking about this issue together with Blacks and whites together. I understand that there are a lot of people that don't agree with that. But I can't know the other in a vacuum. And I know a lot of people that would not, if they didn't have to, they wouldn't face it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to deal with it. Especially if they are white. And unfortunately, it perpetuates the problem.
Right. I just wanted to pitch the idea of Jung's stages of psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, and I think that the first stage of confession at the collective level would be very, very helpful to move in the direction of a truth and reconciliation, and the same way that we have the example in South Africa with Nelson Mandela. And so we simply have to get the truth of what happened, out for people to understand and to stop the denial. Mm-hmm. So I'll just end there. I don't want to monopolize the forum.
Thank you. I agree.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But no, Alan, stay there, because I have a question for you both. It is a provocation. It will sound banal and naive, but it's a provocation. So looking at Freud's idea of aggression as an instinct, as a trip, is nonviolence contra natura, against our own nature?
Well, go ahead, Renee.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Alan. I want to hear you.
No, I would just say I asked myself that question. I don't think I could be John Lewis. You know, I don't know that I could tolerate that level of suffering and injury and terror.
Yeah.
You know, I think, well, it's a time for me to go arm up. Should I be getting a pistol and having it around the way things are looking in America today with the insurrection and the former President Donald Trump? But then I'm also inspired by Renee's, you know, I think depth consideration of nonviolence, the archetype of nonviolence. So I'm ambivalent about it.
Yeah, thank you, because that's really the difference between nonviolence and the archetype of nonviolence. But Renee, what do you think?
I would say I'm ambivalent as well, because while it's organic, it's also it does feel as if it is exceedingly difficult to, I mean, there is this whole paradox between practicing it and it showing up organically, right? And so I want to say it goes against nature, but it doesn't, because I think violence and nonviolence are a little bit like we can't discern where the body and the psyche separate. I think it's almost as if you've got to hold a door open and let it come in organically. Or should I say it's already there, it hasn't been revealed to you until a certain condition, just like anything, comes together, if that makes sense.
Yeah. We have to come to a close now. Thank you, Alan, for joining spontaneously. Thank you, Renee. It was beautiful. We loved it.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
We look forward to welcome you again. Next week, actually, is going to be Luigi Zoya, who couldn't make it 2 weeks ago because he didn't feel very good. Now he's fine, perfect, and ready to kick. He will talk about paranoia and the collective fear. And in 2 weeks, we have 2 sociologists that will talk about individuation and actually psychosocial generativity. It's a very interesting topic. So we're going back to back every week. It's cold outside, so there is nothing better than to join Psychosocial Wednesday. Thank you, everybody. Good night, and buy Renee's book.
Yeah, buy the book. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Ciao.
Bye.